What's the deal, my people? You know this, Don Tony Cephalon. I'm back at you, another one, and this one is Constellation Episode 6, Paul is Dead. And this episode jumps straight back to the beginning of the show and presents us with some information that we already knew, but we needed for them to clarify so we knew exactly what was going on. It was an episode that we needed, that we knew was coming, and it finally did, and we have some answers that you might be needing if you didn't understand everything that's going on. The Don Tony Teflon is here to explain it to you. I'll be referring to Jo as Jo 1 and Jo 2, and Alice as Alice 1, Alice 2, and Paul as Paul 1 and Paul 2. That's the easiest way for me to say it, and I'll explain to you exactly why I need to say it that way. This episode begins just like the first one did. We see International Space Station calling the daughter Alice. So this shot that they show, you have to understand, this is Paul 2, Alice 2, and Jo 2. This is the one who had the affair on her husband. They are the ones that are using the cow for an experiment. Jo 1 holds the iPod horizontally, and her daughter has two pigtails. They're not working on the cow experiment. They did a really quick trick in episode 1. You could see them do the transition. Blink and you'll miss it. Alice 1 talking to her mother Jo 1, but the next shot is of Jo 2, and that is when we see Jo 2 talking to Paul 2, and Paul is conducting the experiment. As you can see, she's holding the iPad vertically instead of horizontally, and they're working on the cow experiment. Now, while Paul is working on the cow experiment, just like we saw before, there's a breach which causes the ISS to decompress, but this time, instead of Paul getting cut in his arm, we see Jo hit her head against the window, causing her death. Now this is Jo 2 that died. We can tell by the way she held on to the iPad. She had it vertically. This is the one who was there when the cow experiment was actually happening with Paul 2. And Jo 1 swapped timelines with this one. We then see Paul go looking for Jo's body. Eventually he does catch up with her body, and he sees that her blood is being sucked outside into space, and that's when he plugs the hole with the Kleenex. And then we get a scene again, blink and you miss it. You can see the cosmonaut that really Jo let free in her timeline fly off into space. After that, we run into Magnus. Now this is Magnus from Jo 1's timeline. This is the Magnus that loves his wife. His wife never had an affair with him. And this is Alice 1. We could tell that it is Alice 1 because she has both pigtails, like I told you before when she was talking to her, and she's informed that her mother has passed away. And after this, we see Paul 2 transported into Jo 1 or Paul 1's timeline, because in that timeline he does not have the cow experiment, and he believes that he lost the cow experiment. At this point in the show, it's just truly a repeat from what we've seen in the first episode, but it's all from Paul's perspective and Paul being in Jo 1's timeline. We see Paul let all the astronauts go, just like we've seen Jo let all the astronauts go. We see her daughter and her husband having to deal with the fact that they think that she's dead. And it was the opposite that Paul and his family had to deal with, them thinking that he was dead. And this is when we see that they can actually see each other in different timelines. This is when Paul's gadget actually catches the alternate Jo's voice on his gadget, and he thinks that it's a ghost, and it kind of spooks him out. And that's when he convinces Mrs. Control not to bring back her body. When Paul gets back to this alternate dimension, we see the flip side of everything that happened to Jo. We see Paul go to Jo's grave, and when we seen Jo at the grave before, we seen that she's seen Paul, we see that Paul can actually see her too. So that just wasn't a hallucination. We then see Paul having dinner with the astronauts. Also, Alice and Magnus are there, and Alice asked him exactly what happened to her mother, and Paul vividly describes exactly what happened to her mother, which forces Magnus to storm out of the room, taking Alice. And then we see Paul look over, and he can see the alternate universe where he passed away, and the memorial service is for himself. We then see Alice walking through the garage, and this is when she stomps on the rabbit. We seen this in episode 1 and she blamed her friend for doing it, but now we can clearly see that it was Alice from a different dimension that was stomping on the rabbit. After this, we see Paul getting debriefed, and he starts talking about the Cal experiment, which they tell him there never was a Cal experiment, that he was bugging on that, and that that's been disbanded for a whole bunch of years now. The conversation then shifts over to why he left Joe's body up there, and we see Frederick getting mad about this. Now, we know that in that dimension, the alternate universe, right, that he had an affair with Joe. But in this universe, it shouldn't be like that, because in this universe where he was put in, this is where Magnus and Joe never separated. So it's kind of weird that he would get this upset, but I'll explain a little bit more of this later. We then see Alice return home, and she sees the gifts that were left, and she starts smashing up all the gifts, not happy that the gifts are there because she knows that her mother is dead. But while she's doing this, she starts to hear her mother playing the piano, and she looks over to where the piano was supposed to be, and she realizes at that second that the piano is not there. Paul then begins to look up some YouTube videos about the Apollo 18 mission. While he's watching it, he can hear Bud clearly say the 2 men have died, which brings up an alarm because in his timeline, this did not happen. He then goes to meet with Michaela to ask her about Henry, but she doesn't know Henry, she only knows him as Bud, and she knows him as a drunk and the bum that he's become, but he doesn't realize that because he still thinks it's Henry, the person who actually trained him to become an astronaut. Paul and his family then get inside the car and they head over to Joe's wake. Now, while at Joe's wake, we can see that Alice is hiding inside of the cupboard like she normally does. We can see the beads outside. These are the same beads that we see in episode 1 that she uses to put down a trail when she's walking across the ice with Joe. Not the Joe that's her mother, Joe 1, because Joe 1 can smell the difference between her and her daughter. After that, Paul gets to the wake. When he gets to the wake, him and his wife get into an argument because she says that he's mentally not fit for it. While there, he gets into an argument with his daughter, actually calls her an asshole. Her daughter drags back Alice and tells Alice that her father said that her mother might still be alive. Paul 2 and Alice 1 then look over, and when they do, that is when they see Alice 2. Not only do they see Alice 2, they see Joe 1 with Alice 2 and Magnus 2, all in the alternate dimension that we've seen in the other episodes. Magnus tells Alice that they need to get away, and Alice convinces him that she wants to go up to the cabin, her mother's cabin. We know that this is Alice 1. Why? Because she has the red cap on. When we look at the previous videos, when we see Joe from episode 1, Alice is wearing the blue cap. So there's red Alice and blue Alice. Red Alice is actually her daughter. Now we then see Paul go and search out Henry. After he finds him, they get inside the cabin. When we go back to the cabin, we see them show the picture of the changeling. She says that this is a picture that her mother likes a lot, but her father doesn't. The changeling is a story about babies that get swapped from human babies all the way to changeling babies, and the changeling babies get raised as if they were humans by these fae. Now, after that, we see Bud finally confronted by Paul. Paul can't believe the mess that he is because he thinks that he's Henry, but in actuality he is Bud. After talking to him and trying to get answered at him, Bud then pulls a gun, and what he apparently does is shoot him. We've seen this bait and switch before. I don't know if he's dead. After that, we see Alice sleeping, but while she wakes up, she can look out the window and she sees her mother from the alternate dimension pulling up to the cabin, and this is the reason why she wanted to go to the cabin in the first place. Now, if you follow my channel and this is not your first time watching me talk about this show, you know that I've been pretty spot on with all of my predictions so far. And I've told you in previous videos that you can track the people by their hairstyle. You can also track them by the red and blue colors. And we see some more of that come to fruition. But let's go back to the man that Joe supposedly was having an affair with. When we look at him in this episode, it seems like he was having an affair. But if Paul is in the dimension with Alice 1, meaning that Joe was loyal to her husband, there's no reason for this guy to get that upset unless This is a third timeline that we're being shown, because we've been told before that a particle can be black, a particle can be white, and a particle can exist in both places at the same time, meaning there are three different timelines that is going on right now. But you tell me what you think in the comment section, and if you like the way I do this, please thumbs up this, spread this across the realm, and of course subscribe. And until next time, you know who it is. Peace and stay sexy.